Well, Patrick Cook here. So thanks for joining me in the next session of our Mandelbulb 3D Tutorial Series within the context of actually building a Mandelbulb 3D animation. We're way up in the 60s when it comes to the number of the session that we've done so far. If you're joining me at this stage of the tutorial series and you haven't viewed the sessions prior to this, I really do encourage you to go back and catch up with whatever earlier sessions you haven't watched. Reason being is simply because when I have discussed something, I'm kind of assuming that you'll understand that topic, or at least you have enough to work with that you can use the Mandelbulb 3D software efficiently, and I move on. I have to make the assumption that you've actually viewed the earlier sessions. All right, so enough of that lecture. Um, let's kind of pick up a couple things that we've kind of skirted around as we've moved through the tutorial series so far. Let's turn our attention over here to the navigator. Now this navigator windows exactly the way we left it in the last session. And it really doesn't even matter what the graphic looks like because I want to show you a couple buttons that we haven't really talked about yet. Now, you know that you've seen me punch this parameter thing here a number of times. I've got my main window. I'm going to press the parameter, and obviously what that does is it pulls all of my formula parameters over to this tab area right here. And as you know from previous discussions, I mean, I could take let's put let's change that end on the scale, that end from 5 to 8. All right, here's my scale. There's my 5 on the end. So if I pull that parameter over, see that went to an 8. So it's actually very simple. The parameter will pull your formula and your lighting over to the navigator. Obviously, the navigator, by design, is rendering a less detailed image, so that it doesn't. So your computer doesn't spend a lot of time drawing this as you whip through with your navigation. Now, when I pull the parameter over, the whole picture redraws. All right, and that's typically what I want. But you have another option here where you can pull the formulas over, just the formulas, not the lighting, just the formulas. Let's prove it. So I have, that's a 7.8. I'm gonna make that a 7.3. All right, now watch this one over here, scale. All right, pull the formula over, that went to a 3. So what I've done here is I've just pulled the formulas over. I didn't pull any lighting. What's the use case for that? Well, basically, I don't use it that often, but when I do use it, um, I'm 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 interested more in the formulas coming over from main than I am the lighting. I typically don't use the navigator to help me develop the lighting. I don't really need to, because back over here on main, the lighting tab, when you make a change to lighting, it will update the main image, which is pretty cool. All right. I don't need the navigator for lighting. I really don't. I get a, I get a kind of a low resolution rendering of the lighting, but it's not detailed enough for me to really understand if I've got the lighting right. I mean, if you look at this navigator rendering, I mean, I see shadows down there and stuff, you know, I do, but it's just not the same as looking at it in detail. So the use case for pulling over your formulas really comes down to you want the formulas to be pulled over, but you don't care about the lighting. So for whatever value that is to you, but the button's there if you want it. You need it. Here I can pull over just the lighting. Just the lighting. So if I punch that button, what I've done is I pulled over just the lighting without the formulas. All right, so it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Here I can actually set presets of these. So if I were to reduce the lighting for whatever reason I'd want to do this, well, maybe I would want that. Maybe I would. Let me turn off the coordinates and the guides just to simplify it. Maybe I want to see just what the highlights are in the scene. So what I can do is I can draw this way, 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 way down. I don't get much detail in here, but I do see where the highlights are. So that could actually be very helpful. All right, and you can use these this area right here to assign presets for this lighting arrangement. I personally don't use that. I don't really need it. All right, if I want to modify this lightning, I just go in here and I just do it. But you can assign presets. All right. Now, this tab right here, miscellaneous. All right. This is getting into some pretty interesting stuff. There is actually quite a bit of, I guess, maybe for 2010 and maybe even for today, there's some pretty sophisticated, what shall we say, visual effects that go on in the code of the Mandelbulb 3D. It's referred to as ray tracing. It's a very sophisticated way of having a computer, a personal computer, simulate a three-dimensional environment. It's called ray tracing. Now, the Mandelbulb 3D software uses ray tracing in order to render the scene as a simulated 3D. It is what's interesting about the Mandelbulb 3D implementation of the ray tracing is that it's an older style of ray tracing that, interestingly enough, does a very, very, very good job at what it does. There are current software applications, I don't know, things like Blender and some of the other, shall we say, image rendering software that is using a more updated, a more efficient, a faster rendering process. It's still kind of ray tracing, but the technology behind ray tracing has improved and morphed over the last decade or two. But the Mandelbulb 3D uses a ray tracing methodology that is very labor intensive, but actually produces some very, very good results. Now, with that said, very, very, very simple explanation for the moment. These controls over here are miscellaneous for a reason. They don't necessarily equate to one another, but what they do is they help in establishing some of the parameters that go into the under the covers ray tracing computations. One is called R bailout, smooth DE combined. You got your DE stop, max iterations. So those four right there pertain to the rendering, the 3D rendering, which we which operates along the lines of an older style ray tracing. This dynamic fog here, all right, this button will actually the ITS stands for iterations, and it's got nothing to do with the ray tracing down here. This will actually be more faithful in the rendering of your dynamic fog as you have set it up over here in the lighting panel. It'll be more faithful in replicating in the navigator your dynamic fog, or if I switch that, it'll be more faithful in rendering the colors into the navigator preview. I don't really use it that much, to be honest with you, because I don't really need it here. All right. I like to look at my lighting and my coloring over on the main, but you do have provisions to improve the quality of your navigation rendering in terms of the dynamic fog or color. All right. Oh, I got a few more things to tell you, but we're out of time on this session. Let's end this session here. I'll see you in the next session.